My name is Marie, and I grew up in Venezuela in a very loving home, and I'm a teacher now. I have to say my grandmothers were always a part of my faith. They taught me how to pray, and they were just really important in my upbringing. I attended a Catholic high school, and I just met great people there, teachers, friends that really showed me what it was to believe and be passionate about God. That being said, I always saw God more like a distant, loving but distant, powerful king that was protecting me. But I felt like I had to go through these protocols and different prayers and steps just to talk to him. Like, it wasn't something that I could just do whenever, or at least that's not how it felt to me. So once I graduated high school, it didn't take long for me to distance myself a little bit. I would just go to church if I had time, when I had time. And I ended up meeting my husband, John, in college, and I think he had a similar story. We would not really have conversations about God or religion. We would just go to church on holidays, and yeah, that was the most that we would do regarding our faith. And then I remember one day we were talking to our cousin Mark, and he told us that they were starting this great church here in Miami, and he seemed very excited about it. And John told him that we would check it out, but I thought that it was maybe him just being nice. Like, I didn't think we were serious about it. But of course we were supportive, so we came, and there was no going back from there. Like, we've been coming ever since. That was maybe 3 years ago. So I remember I was having a conversation with Greg one day, and there was something that stayed with me. And he basically said, you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to feel like you graduated from the Bible, or you know everything, or you have 100% faith in everything. Like, he said, you just need to commit to living your life following Jesus, and this is the day when I decide that I'm doing life with all its ups and downs with Jesus by my side. So that for me was big, just seeing regular people like me having the same doubts, the same circumstances, and just notice that commitment and that passion for Jesus Christ can make a whole difference. I feel peace trusting Jesus, just knowing that no matter what life has in store for us in the future, I know that it's part of God's plan. I can rest in that, and if I have God as my purpose and my reason, then everything will be okay. My name is Marie, and this is my starting point.
Well, that's awesome. Hey, I want to welcome you here to Miami Church. If I don't know you, my name is Greg. I'm one of the pastors here. It's so good to see you this morning, and I'm fired up because we're going to talk about my favorite thing in the whole wide world today. So if I get a little crazy, that'll be okay. Sorry, front row. It's just spit. And so we've been in this series. If you're new here, we've been in a conversation about faith. And the whole idea is we said, hey, all of us, every single one, regardless of your background, where you're from, the color of your skin, all of us have questions and doubts when it comes to the idea of faith. And that's okay. And what we've been trying to encourage each other over this 8 weeks is, hey, we've all got the questions of doubt. What if we intentionally pursued those questions and doubts? What if we went after those, and instead of letting it cripple us, what if we engage those? And we've encouraged each other, hey, what would it look like to take your next step of faith? Like, whatever that is, to take your next step of faith. And so we've been in this conversation, and we said, hey, everything has a starting point, including your faith. But here's the great news, right? Jesus is saying, hey, you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have every question answered. You don't have to have every I dotted and every T crossed. In fact, you just follow me. Just trust me. Just start taking steps of faith, and I will meet you on the journey. And so we've been on this journey together, and we've been sharing stories, a lot like you just heard with Marie, and we've been sharing these stories with each other, and it's been a great journey together. And I'll just review, catch you up if you haven't been here. Here's where we've been. We started in week 1. We said, hey, the starting point of faith, if you are really serious about the idea of God and Jesus, the starting point of faith is just a simple question. Who is Jesus? And every single one of us has to answer that question. Who is Jesus? And who do we think that he is? And then we've talked about the idea of sin. And we said, hey, sin, when Jesus talked about it, was not a form of condemnation, but rather a form of restoration. That Jesus is restoring the relationship. We talked about the idea of rules. Any of you that have any type of religious background, rules and religion seem to be synonymous. And we talked about what is the relationship or the role of rules as it relates to God. And then we started talking about the idea of forgiveness. And we said, hey, sometimes I can get the idea that maybe God can forgive me for some of the stuff I've done in my past mistake, but I have a hard time forgiving myself. And how do we handle that? What do we do with that? And we talked about the idea of bargaining, that all of us negotiate with God. God, if you get me through this, then I will. And we said, God doesn't negotiate because God doesn't want something from you. He rather wants something for you. And then last week, we said that something happened. Right? There was this hinge, there was this point in time that everything changed, and we said it was the resurrection, when Jesus died on a Friday and he actually came back to life on a Sunday, and we said that the resurrection, we unpacked that, and we said if the resurrection is true, if Jesus actually was dead on Friday and Saturday and alive on Sunday, if that's really true, then every single thing he said is true, and you've got to do something with that. You've got to do something with that. And today I want to close this conversation by talking about something that happened, and I believe it's overwhelming evidence for Jesus being who he said he was. And maybe today could be your starting point in faith. And I believe this applies to all of us, whether you're new and this is your first time and you're trying to just figure out what's going on in this place, and maybe you are exploring and just trying to kind of put your toe in the water a little bit, like, what is this Bible Jesus stuff? I'm just not sure. Somebody told me something when I was a kid, but it just doesn't really align with my adult existence. Or maybe you're here and you're like, I'm in. I'm following as hard after Jesus as I can. I believe what we're going to talk about today applies to every single one of us. And this is something, you got to know this. This is so important, and this is so foundational. You just got to know this. And so I want you to go with me. You guys are smart, and you'll track where I'm going today. And I want to start talking about a guy named Matthew. And Matthew, I don't have time to tell his whole story, but basically he was what was called a tax collector, which in that day and age was really just a bad guy. He's just a crook, someone who stole money and deceived people. And Matthew has this encounter, and he turns into a follower of Jesus. And so here's Matthew. He's this follower of Jesus. And Matthew's going to tell us the story. He's going to say, one day, Jesus and his followers, his disciples as he called them, were walking, and they were in this city. They were about 150 miles north of Jerusalem, and they were in this city called Caesarea Philippi. And you can see there's a picture of it here. It's really not a lot going on there. If you went there today, it would look like that, just kind of dust and trees. That's very exciting. And in this city, what's interesting about this city, it had been renamed Caesarea Philippi after the first Roman emperor, whose name was Caesar Augustus, who died in about 14 AD. And so it was named after him. And so you could see Jesus and his 12 guys, right, just kind of strolling down the dirt road. And they're having this conversation, and maybe they're talking about maybe they're talking about Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus, some of you history buffs know, was the first Roman Empire. He was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar in that culture, in that time, was considered a god there. And so maybe they're talking about this as they're walking into this dusty city, and they're having this conversation. And Matthew records the conversation, and he says, as they're walking and talking, Jesus just turns and he asks a question. And this is a question you know, even if you're not a church person or a Bible person, you've probably heard this. Jesus turns to his followers and he asks a question, and he says, who do you say that I am? Like, who do you think I am? And if you know the conversation, Peter, who was kind of the loudmouth of the crowd, he blurts out, and you see it here in Matthew 16, he blurts out and he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. He's saying, hey, we're walking into Caesarea Philippi, and Caesar Augustus is the son of the dead God because Julius Caesar is dead, but you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, bingo, Peter, you got it, but listen, man, you're smart, but you're not that smart. The reason you knew that is because my Father in heaven told you the answer to that. And so they keep going. And something right here, amazing. You can't miss this. Something amazing happens. Something astounding. Jesus is going to make a prediction. And if you just cruise right through this, you miss this. He makes this amazing prediction. Here's what he says. It can't overstate how important is this. He says, Peter, guys, on this rock, I will build my church. On this rock, I will build my church. Now, you see this word rock. On this rock, I'll build it. Now, the rock, people have different ideas what this is. Catholics believe that the rock is Peter because Jesus was talking to Peter. Protestants say, no, the rock is not Peter. The rock is the declaration that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And that's a fun conversation, and we can have that conversation one day. But I believe the significance to this conversation is not who the rock is. The significance to this conversation is this bold prediction that Jesus makes. He says, I will build my church. Now, those of you who know anything about the Bible, you know that Jesus spoke in Aramaic. So when he was on the earth, he spoke in Aramaic. But the New Testament, right, the second part of the Bible, was written in Greek. And so Matthew, the guy that recorded all this, right, the guy that was there, the eyewitness to all this, and the guy that wrote this down, he actually wrote it in Greek. And so he wrote it. So when he wrote it, he says, I will build my, here's the Greek word, I will build my, you guys know Greek? No, yeah, ecclesia, right? I will build my ecclesia. That's the word. And this little Greek word ecclesia, it actually means gathering or assembly. That's the literal meaning of this word. It's the idea that, hey, we gather to go or we assemble to go. And that's the idea. And so when Jesus is making this prediction, this bold statement, I will build my church, what he's saying is, hey, I'm gonna build my gathering. I'm gonna build a movement of people. Now, just imagine, okay, you're there, right? If you were there that day when they're walking down this dusty road and they're talking maybe about Caesar Augustus and they're talking like, I'm going to build my church, and they're going like, we're in the middle of nowhere, right? I mean, we're walking in the middle of nowhere. There's not even a Starbucks here, Jesus. There's just dust and dirt, and you're going to build some kind of movement? Like, what are you even talking about? And Jesus is saying, hey, guys, listen up. I'm going to build a gathering. I'm going to build a movement of people. Guys, we're starting a movement. Like, okay, great, right, I believe you. Now, something happened here, and this is important. If you've been around Miami Church a little bit, you've probably heard me talk about this because it's so important, and I'll continue to talk about this. But something terrible happened, right? Something really happened. I would call it a tragedy that actually happened. And what happened is these eyewitnesses, right, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these guys who wrote the Gospels, they wrote it in Greek. And what happened over time in history is as things were being translated from Greek into other languages, they didn't translate this word ecclesia. They didn't translate it that way. In fact, in medieval times, some terrible, terrible things happened, and everything really went wrong with the church. And this tragic part of history was in some way, in some fashion, launched by a misunderstanding of this word that Matthew wrote. And so what happened in translation is instead of translating ecclesia, they ended up translating this word, and this is a German word. And you can see the English derivative of this, right? Like, I can't speak German, but like church, you see church. And this word that came around in about 300 AD, it actually means like house of the Lord. It's talking about a church building. It's talking about the idea of organized religion. And there was this tragedy that happened in the translation, and the tragedy of the translation caused a change in the idea, the key point, the idea. And it went from this idea of a movement to a location, and it went from this idea of a people to a place. And what resulted from this linguistic shifting, this change from ecclesia, was that it went from a gathering, a movement, to an idea of a location. And it just has resulted in some very, very unfortunate things in the church. In fact, I would say this miss that happened hundreds, even thousands of years ago, results in why many people even today turn their back on the local church. In fact, it's why some of you have walked away. And some of you have had experiences and you walked away from church and maybe you're back here giving it another chance. But see, what happened in 300 AD was a shift in thinking, and Jesus is saying, no. I did not predict a place, I predicted a people. When I made the bold prediction, I wasn't predicting a building, I was talking about a movement. I said, I will build my ecclesia. I will build my church, my gathering, my assembly. Now, this is fun. I'm a history guy, so I just got to throw this in real quick. In the 1500s, there was a guy who showed up in England by the name of William Tyndale. Here he is. Now, this picture was taken before the whole thing, smile, say cheese, was invented. So he didn't have that yet. How you doing, William? And that hair is awesome. If I had hair, I would do that. But I don't have hair, so maybe one of you. But so William Tyndale was this British guy, and he very smart, educated. He spoke like 7 languages. And he actually knew ancient Hebrew and Greek. And he was reading the New Testament, the Gospels. He was reading in Greek. And he had one of those moments when you're reading, and then you're like, whoa, what I'm reading and what I'm experiencing when I'm part of a church are completely different. And so he decided he was going to make it his life mission to actually translate the Greek New Testament into English. And he's the first person to ever do this. No one had ever done this. He's going to take it Greek because in that time, in the 16th century, what would happen at church is you would go to church and there would be priests, there would be people that would lead the church, and they would speak in a language that you didn't even understand, and they would read the Bible in a language that you didn't know, and the people in authority held control, right? They controlled the church and they controlled the people, and it was really a bad thing. And so William Tyndale said, that's it, I've had enough. Now you can imagine he wasn't very popular with the Pope and the cardinals and the priests, but he decided he was going to translate into English from the Greek. And so he's the first one to do that. And so he ended up having to flee England and go to Germany to hide out. But he did it. It took him some years, and he did it. And thanks to the Gutenberg Press, if you guys know this, he began to distribute copies of the New Testament for the very first time into English. And suddenly the average person like you and me, we could actually read it on our own. We could like look through there and go, wow, that's it. And he was eventually, William Tyndale, he was eventually convicted as a heretic, and they killed him, but it was too late because the word was already out. And all of a sudden this controlled institutional church that had all of this thing, it started to lose its power because people could read for themselves what Jesus was saying when he said, I will build my church. Now here's what's interesting. Here's the tie-in, right? Tyndale, when he was reading through this and he got to Matthew 16, when he got to the word church, when he says, I will build my church, right? As he's looking at that in the Greek, as he translated it into English, he said, I will build my gathering, right? He put the word gathering because that's what the original word means. And it was his attempt, right? It was William Tyndale's attempt to try to return the church back to the original idea that Jesus had. Now, what's interesting is this line of thinking that happened with this linguistic change, this change way back, this line of thinking still permeates the minds of most people in Miami in 2019. I mean, I remember a couple years ago, my wife and I moved here with this idea to help plant a church, right? We're going to start a church. And so we'd be out at different places meeting people like, hey, what do you do? Well, I'm trying to start a church. And you know what the first question people would ask me is? Where's your building? We're trying to start a church. Where's your building? Where's your place? Where do you meet? Like, oh, I don't think you get it. See, I will build my church. Jesus didn't predict a place. He predicted a people, right? Jesus did not predict a building. He predicted a movement. It's why we here at Miami Church, we call this place, we call it 2150. Right? We don't say, hey, I'll meet you at Miami Church. We say, I'll meet you at 2150. That's just a small thing that we're trying to do to get in line with what Jesus did when he says, I will build my ecclesia. It's a gathering. It's an assembly. Now, from Matthew chapter 16, I'm going to speed this up quick, okay? So from Matthew 16, they're on the road to Caesarea Philippi, and the story fast forwards, right? They end up going back to Jerusalem. And Jesus gets arrested, you know the story, and then he gets tried, and they actually put him on a cross, and he dies. And so on the Friday, they put Jesus on the cross and he died. And we talked about this last week. If you missed it, you can see it at miamichurch.com. But we said on Friday, when Jesus was dead, right, there was no followers, there was no movement, there was no church, there was nothing. Because when Jesus died, when he died on the cross, the movement died with him because the movement was Jesus. And so Jesus died, and so these men and women who were his followers, they ran, they fled, they hid, they quit. They were out. But then something happened. Again, we talked about this last week. There's this hinge point that happens. And what happened was that there was a resurrection. And these same men and women who had ran, who had fled, who had quit, all of a sudden became this fired up bunch of people who were fired up around this idea of Jesus because they had seen him dead on Friday and alive on Sunday. And so now they're already fired up. And so Jesus, after he comes back to life, he gathers these followers together, and we think there's probably about 120 of them, probably something similar to what's going on right here in this room, right? And and then Jesus says famous words to them. Again, even if you're not a church person, you probably heard these words, but he says something to his followers that is tied directly to his prediction that I will build my church. Now, these are familiar words. You'll see them. I'll throw them on the screen. It says this, okay? He's alive. Remember, he's died on Friday. He's back on Sunday. Now he's back. He's got 120 people in front of him, and he says this. Jesus came to them and he said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And he's giving them instructions, right? He's telling the 120 what to do. Next verse, he says this. Therefore go and make disciples of who? All nations, right? Everybody. Go. Right? You've seen it. Go tell. Baptize them. We're going to do that this afternoon. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. Right? He's saying go. You've seen it. You've witnessed it. You've experienced it. Now your mission, right, is to go. Go be the ecclesia. Go be this, I will build my church. And he says, surely I will be with you always to the very end of the age. And so this was the starting point, right? This was the beginning of the movement, right, that we call church, what he called the ecclesia. And it began to move and it began to grow. And there's exciting times as things started to kind of grow and move. But what happened is, if you study the history, it grew for a while, but it got to a place where it got stuck. It got stalled. And they weren't pushing, they weren't risking. In fact, it became too centric in kind of the hub of the day in Jerusalem. And instead of going all out to the whole world, like he says, like all nations, everyone, all the world, they just really didn't venture too far from home. And so I can imagine, and this isn't in the Bible, right? This is in my head, this imaginary conversation that's happening between God the Father and Jesus. And they're having this conversation, and it's like, hey, Jesus, come over here. Look down here. We've got a problem. The movement isn't moving. It's not growing. It's supposed to be dynamic and to grow. And these guys that were with you, I mean, look at these guys. I mean, they're nice guys and everything, but I don't think they got the all nations part. I think they heard neighborhood and you were saying nations. I don't think they understood what you were saying. And so they're stuck. He's like, we got to find somebody. We need to find somebody who can go beyond Jerusalem. We need to find somebody who will risk and push the limits and be aggressive and focused and who won't take no for an answer. We need a mover and shaker. We need somebody who will just go and get it. Because this is an all nations thing and we got to go. Hey, Jesus, come here. Look over at this guy. Saul of Tarsus. He's not on our team. I mean, he's single-handedly trying to destroy everything that we started. Yeah, let's go recruit that guy. Right? In Acts chapter 9, we don't have time to read it this morning. In Acts chapter 9, there's the story of a guy named Saul who becomes Paul. He was Saul, but he became Paul. And in Acts 9, he tells this story has this encounter with Jesus. And Paul, for skeptics, for people who don't believe, Paul is a problem for skeptics. Because Paul was around and writing 25 years after the whole cross and resurrection thing. 25 years after the resurrection, Paul is writing all of his stuff down, and Paul is writing while there's still eyewitnesses walking around. In fact, the writings of Paul predate the Gospels. They predate Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the writings of Paul. And so I can just imagine Paul, right? He has this encounter with Jesus. He's fired up. I mean, this guy's awesome and crazy. And here's Paul. I can just imagine he makes his way back to Jerusalem. And the first followers are gathered in a room like this. And he makes his way back in there. And Paul just strikes me as like a coach. Any of you guys play sports? And, you have the coach, and he's like, oh, at halftime, he's going to like try to pump you up. And I could just see him walking into the room with all the followers like, all right, guys, listen up. Coach Paul is here, and I've got a plan. I need you guys to listen up. Things aren't going very well. The scoreboard's not good, but we're going to turn it around the second quarter and the second half. And so here's what I need you to know. And I could just see Paul like throwing a big map on the table. Like, here's what you guys need to know, okay? You guys, you're great. Doing good. Keep hustle. Way to go. You guys take Jerusalem and the surrounding area, okay? And me, and I'm going to recruit some of my guys, we're going to take the world. We're going to take like all nations. That part that you missed when he says all nations, we're going to take that. And so we know the story, right? Paul begins 30 years of traveling. And what does he do? He travels the entire known world at the time, all around the Mediterranean region. And what did he do? Everywhere he stopped, he started little ecclesias, right? He started these little Jesus movements, these gatherings, these Jesus gatherings all over the known world. And that's what Paul did. And he fast forward to the end of his life, right? And here's Paul, if you guys know this. When Paul was about 63 years old, he's in his 60s. When Paul was about 63 years old, he was in a prison in Rome. And you got to go with me here. Okay? Can you just imagine this scene, right? Here's this guy for the past 30 years. He went from persecuting and killing Christians and trying to destroy the church. He has this encounter with Jesus, and he gives 30 years of his life traveling ups and downs, hardships, tears, pain, running for his life, trying to start these little ecclesias, this Jesus movement, trying to do what Jesus said. And here he is, he's 63 years old, and he's sitting in this Roman prison. And we know from history that he's just days away from being executed. And he's been convicted and tried, and they're going to execute him. And he's doing what you would do, right? What would you do if you knew you only had a couple days to live, right? We usually don't get that kind of luxury, but what if you knew, like, hey, 2 days from now, they're going to, like, separate my head and my body, and that's going to be the end of me on this earth? You would just start reflecting, right? You would start thinking back, like, what all did I do? And here's Paul, right? He knows he's just down to his final hours. And he's thinking and reflecting, like, did it work? Like, all the travel and all the conversations and all the writing and all the effort and all the energy and everything I did to try to build, like, did it work? Like, did it make a difference? Like, really, did it really work? And the day comes when he's going to be executed. And he hears the Roman guard come down the stone steps, and they open his cell, and they begin leading him and marching him out across the city to the edge of the city where he's going to be executed. And this would be his last few moments on the earth. And he's on this walk to this place of execution. And I just imagine, what if I could just travel in a time machine? My imagination's going crazy today. But if I could just go to a time machine to that exact moment when Paul is walking from his cell to his place of execution, if I could just go there and just walk beside him, there'd be Roman guards around. If I could just walk beside him, I would just be in his ear, and I'd be like, hey, Paul, it worked. The movement is moving. The gathering is happening. The ecclesia, Paul, is alive. Don't be discouraged, Paul. I know that you're getting ready to die, Paul. I know you gave it all, but I want you to know that it worked. And they're marching. If you've been to Rome, you've seen this picture, right? They're marching through. This is the Roman Forum, right? And they're marching from his prison cell, and they're marching to this place of execution. And I'd be like, Paul, listen, look around, Paul. Look at this great city of Rome, the greatest city in the world at the time. Paul, look around. Paul, right now you look around the city, and what do you see? You see all of these idols and these icons to these Roman and Athenian gods. You see all that. But guess what, Paul? The day's coming when one day this city will be adorned with icons representing Jesus, your Savior, Paul. One day it's going to happen. Paul, listen to me. One day on the tops of all of these buildings in this city, there's going to be crosses. And those crosses, Paul, they're not going to be like honoring that whole idea of Roman execution. All of those crosses are going to be pointing to a single crucifixion of your Savior, Jesus. Paul, it's working. Paul, it works. Paul, you did it. Hey, Paul, look over there. You see that, Paul? That's Nero's circus. And right now, Paul, that's a place where followers of the way, those who say they're followers of Jesus, that's where they get killed. That's where they throw them into the lions. That's where they impale them on sticks. That's where they put tar on them and light them on fire. Paul, that's where your buddy Peter is going to be crucified upside down. You see that? But guess what, Paul? One day, it's hard to believe this, Paul, they're going to build a building there, and it's going to be actually one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. And tourists from all over the world are going to travel to see this building, and it's going to be named for your buddy Peter. Can you believe that, Paul? It's going to happen. Paul, look. And Paul, guess what? One day, again, he's walking to his execution, right? I'm walking. Guess what, Paul? One day, millions of people are going to travel to this city, to this very city, and no one's going to ask, hey, where did they bury Julius Caesar? And where did they bury Caesar? No one's going to ask that. You know what they're going to ask their tour guide? Where was Paul in prison? Paul, I did it. I'm from the future. And I got on an airplane. Okay, I don't have time to tell you what an airplane is, but I got on an airplane and I flew with my money all the way here, and I went to see where you were in prison. Paul, it's working. It's working, Paul. Paul, can you believe this? One day, there'll be no Roman Empire. Can you imagine this? It's the greatest thing in the world right now, Paul. The Roman, one day there's zero. It's only in history books. But guess what? There'll be churches all over the world. There'll be churches in every major city around the world. And Paul, guess what? All those letters that you wrote, remember sitting in prison and you couldn't even see, and you were trying to write these letters and you were giving them to people and you hoped they made it to Ephesus and you hoped they made it to Thessalonica and you just hoped the Christians in Rome read them. Guess what, Paul? One day those letters that you wrote will be translated in over 1,200 languages and spread throughout the entire world. Guess what, Paul? And guess what, Paul? Paul, it worked. I know you're getting ready to lose your head, but Paul, listen. Listen. One day, families all over the world, they're going to talk about Caesar Augustus, right? This first emperor of Rome. They're going to talk about him. But guess what? They're going to talk about him as a footnote to a story about a baby who was born in a manger. And the story won't be about the emperor of Rome. The story's going to be about the baby. Can you believe this, Paul? And guess what, Paul? One day, families all over the world, they're going to name their babies after you and your friends. They're going to call their little kids, they're going to call them James and John and Peter and Paul. And guess what, Paul? These same families, they're going to name their dogs Nero and Caesar. It worked, Paul. The kids are named after you, and the animals are named after the emperors of Paul. Can you imagine? Could you imagine Paul this day? I mean, he's walking. He knows these are his final moments. All this work, all this effort. Paul, can you imagine this? He couldn't imagine it, could he? He couldn't imagine there's no Roman Empire. He couldn't imagine any of this stuff. But guess what? It happened. It happened. It happened just like Jesus said. What did he say? He made a prediction. On a dusty road in the middle of nowhere to a bunch of disciples, he said, God, I'm going to build my ecclesia. And when he said it, it had to be unimaginable, impossible. Like, what are you even talking about, man? We're in the middle of nowhere. We're nobodies. What do you mean? And Jesus said, right here, I will build my church, ecclesia, my movement, my gathering. And he says, the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And the church now is the epicenter of God's activity in the world. And people like you and me, imperfect, crazy people, have been invited to be part of the movement. And he said the church is going to spread all over the world. And it's going to outlast the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is now just a thing of history. The church is still moving. Right? The church is the hope of the world because it's the vehicle with which the message and hope and love of Jesus gets passed on. And Jesus predicted, I'll build my church. I'll build my gathering, my assembly of imperfect people of people who don't have it all figured out, but people who have faith in a resurrected Jesus, and they spread the love and the kindness and the hope of Jesus to everyone. I will build my church. And he made this bold prediction, this bold thing, and he said, I'm going to build my church. And if we're just being honest, Christians and church people have tried to screw this up for thousands of years, right? I mean, churches, Christians have done stupid things, dumb things, imperfect, inconsistent. The church has come under attack. It's been persecuted. There's people who've tried to destroy it. Churches have tried to add to what Jesus said, like, oh, that's good, Jesus, that's cute, but we want to add some other stuff to it. We're going to add our own stuff. Like, people have tried to do all kinds of things to the church, but yet, in spite of all of that, here we are. Here we are. Still going, still moving, still alive, still well, and as we're going to see this afternoon, still seeing people's lives transformed by the message of Jesus. I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. You can't stop it. Can't stop it. Nothing can stop it. I don't care how dumb we are, how stupid we are. You can't stop it. And you and I have been invited into this greatest thing ever. We've been invited into this movement, this Jesus movement, this gathering, this ecclesia. And it's why when we started this church a couple of years ago, we said, hey, whatever we do, we don't know. We don't even know what we're doing. I don't even know what we're doing right now. But we don't even know what we're doing. But we're just going to help as many people as we can find and follow Jesus. We're just going to help start a church, and then we want that church to be a church that helps plant other churches all around Miami-Dade. We want as many people in this great city that we love in Miami-Dade to know the hope and the love of Jesus. And so we're just going to take this, what you said, Jesus, we're going to just try to build the church. Like the truth, as close as we can get to the real thing. Right? We're not going to get it perfect, but we're going to try to get as close to the ecclesia, to the gathering, to the movement. And that's why our vision is to help plant a gospel movement right here in Miami-Dade that unleashes people like you and me all over this city to love on our neighbors and our families and our communities. So I close with a question for you and for me. I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And then the greatest, craziest thing is Jesus says, oh, and I want you guys, ordinary, with all your questions, with all your doubts, with all your imperfections, with all your challenges, with all your problems. I get it. I see that. I want you guys to come be a part of it. I want you guys to be the church, to be the people, to be the movement. And so you and I have been invited. And so what do you need to do to engage this mission, this movement, this gathering? What is it you need to do? What's your next step? We come to the end of this conversation about faith, and it's all about you taking a step of faith. Some of you need to, for the very first time, you need to put your faith in Jesus and say, hey, I'm in. I got questions, but I'm in. I want to follow Jesus. There's some of you today that you need to take the first step of following Jesus and be baptized. We're having a baptism celebration this afternoon. When we're done here in a few minutes, we're going to head out to Bill Baggs out on Key Biscayne, and we've got at least 4 or 5 people already. Maybe you just say, hey, I'm in. I want to stand before and say, I'm in. I want to help build the church. I want to be baptized. Some of you need to start serving. You need to serve. Some of you need to start giving. Some of you need to start inviting more people and friends and family to be a part of this. I will build my church. I'll build my movement, my ecclesia, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. When we think church, Jesus didn't predict a place. He predicted a people, right? Jesus, he didn't predict a building. This isn't a church. This is just a building. Jesus didn't predict a building. He predicted a movement. Now build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. Would you pray with me? God, I believe your church is the greatest thing in the world. And though we have tried to screw it up and mess it up and done some really bad things, God, you are still at work. You're still moving. You're still on the move. And so, God, may the mission, the purpose, the core of your church continue to grow right here in this city. God, may you birth something in hearts of people like me and the people in this room, God, that even though we don't have it all figured out, and we got questions and doubts, and we're uncertain, God, may we just seek you and follow you with everything we've had. So, God, I pray over the men and women in this place now. God, that we could just capture the heart of your church, that we could just capture the truth of what you want to do, God. And so we love you now, and we pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.